So next for this week, we're going to start with a very surface level discussion of the cardiovascular, respiratory, and renal body systems. So I do have a few pictures on here of real hearts, real images. We talk about blood and stuff like that, so just wanted to give you a warning about that in case that bothers you. But let's dive in. Don't forget to be studying your key terms as much as possible because the more you know the key terms, the better you'll be on the quizzes. So the cardiovascular system, this is your heart and your blood vessels and your blood, and the whole job of the cardiovascular system, or the circulatory system as it's also called, is to transport oxygen, nutrients, waste, hormones, all of these important contents from cell to cell around the body. Mainly sends oxygen-rich blood to all of the tissues and organs in our body, and then receives the oxygen-poor blood from the body, sends that to the lungs to pick up more oxygen, and then sends it out to the body. So these are real images from, I don't know if you've ever heard of Bodyworks. It's a really cool exhibit that tours around the world where they found a way to plasticize all of the different tissues and organs in the body. So you can see different parts dissected out. So this is a real rabbit that had its entire circulatory system plasticized, and you can see its heart and every single one of its vessels, and then the same here for a human. So this is truly a very interconnected web of tons of different wires, and it goes everywhere in the body. So the primary organ for this system is the heart. It is a hollow organ, pretty much made up of muscle that is about the size of your fist. So whatever your fist is for your body, that is basically the size of your heart. And it's located in between your lungs in a pocket called the mediastinum. And it's, like I said, mainly composed of muscle, but also some connective tissue to hold it all together. So the bottom tip of the heart is called the apex, and it usually points down towards your left foot. The heart beats usually for a person somewhere around 70 times a minute. If you are in very good physical condition, your resting heart rate will be a lot lower. If you're in very poor physical condition, it will be a lot higher because it is a muscle, and so it can contract more strongly or less strongly depending on how much you work it. And just an interesting fun fact, but you pump enough blood in 1 year to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's how much blood your body will circulate, and your heart will circulate every day. Or every year, excuse me. So the heart is primarily muscle, and that muscle is incredibly thick. We call it the myocardium, and it has basically 3 different layers. There's an inner layer that's quite thin, then the really thick myocardial muscle, and then an external endocardium. Or I'm sorry, epicardium here, endocardium on the inside, excuse me. And basically these just help protect the endocardium, and the epicardium just help protect the muscle of the heart itself. Now, I did say the heart was hollow, so we have 4 different chambers inside the heart. There's 2 chambers up at the top that have a really thin wall. These are called atria. Singular is atrium. So the right atrium receives blood that does not have oxygen from the body. The left atrium receives blood that has oxygen from the lungs. And then you have on the bottom your 2 chambers called the ventricles. And this is where most of that thick muscle is found. This is the part of your heart that actually beats and has to beat strongly to propel the blood out of your heart. They're separated, the 2 ventricles, by a thick wall of muscle called the septum. And the right ventricle receives the deoxygenated blood from the right atrium. So it comes in, first funnels into the right atrium, then goes into the right ventricle, and then gets pushed out into the lungs. Then the left ventricle receives the blood from the left atrium. So it comes back from the lungs, comes back into here, and then gets pumped out into the rest of the body. Now, if you noticed, in between the atria and the ventricles are flaps. And these flaps are most commonly known as valves. So you've probably heard of a heart valve before. And the whole point of these valves is to prevent the blood from going the wrong way. We want our blood to continue in one direction through our circulatory circuit. We don't want it to then all of a sudden reverse itself. So the flaps, the valves, are just there to keep the blood flowing in one direction. And a heart murmur is what occurs when your valves don't close completely. So there's a leak in them, and that leak on the stethoscope that the doctor uses to listen to your heart sounds like a whoosh or a wet leaking sound. Heart murmurs are bad because overall they'll decrease the efficiency of your heart, and that causes your heart to have to work harder, and the harder your heart has to work, the more stress that's put on your heart, the faster it will break down and it'll deteriorate. And we'll talk in class about an example where engineering has helped with people who are born or develop heart murmurs. External to the heart is the pericardium. So it's a sac that surrounds the heart, and this helps prevent friction damage to the heart itself. So the heart is constantly beating, and that beating, it creates motion. And your heart is not just in a nice little bath of, frictionless liquid. It's actually right next to your lungs. It's butting against your rib cage. So as your heart beats, it's constantly rubbing up on these other organs and tissues in your body. And that over time, that friction could lead to deterioration and damage to the heart, and we don't want that. So instead, we cover the heart with the pericardium. It's a really thin sac, and in between the pericardium and the heart is pericardial fluid. And the point of that is as the heart beats, it will beat inside this fluid inside the pericardium and reduce all that friction. So the heart has an intrinsic conduction system. So yes, your brain and your hormones can tell your heart to beat faster or beat slower, but overall, the heart can continue to beat on its own for a little while outside of direction of the nervous system because it has that intrinsic system built in. So it's like an little electrical system that it has on its own. The signal to beat starts at the apex or the bottom of the heart and then travels up through the heart itself. So our brain and our hormone systems, they help to control the overall direction of how we beat our hearts, but the heart itself is fairly self-functioning, and that's why you can cut a heart out of an individual and it will continue to beat for a time before it ceases. Then, in order to move our blood from the heart through the rest of our body to every single one of the cells in your body, we need vessels. So there's three main types of vessels that we're going to talk about: arteries, veins, and capillaries. So arteries are usually depicted as red, and they're going to carry blood away from the heart. Think artery A away. And this is usually under really strong positive pressure because it's coming straight from the heart that is squeezing it out with a lot of force. So the blood gets propelled throughout the body that way, and then we use up all the oxygen in that blood. And it gets transferred then into veins. These carry deoxygenated blood back to the heart, and these aren't pressurized. At this point, the positive pressure of the beating of your heart kind of slows down. So we need valves inside our veins to prevent the backflow of blood, just like we do with the valves in our heart. And then in between arteries and veins are much smaller vessels, and they get all the way down to capillaries. So capillaries are the absolute smallest vessels in your body. So small that they barely fit one red blood cell. So here's the wall of this capillary on this side, and here's the wall on the other side, and these red discs are red blood cells. So the red blood cell can barely fit through these tiny capillaries. These are the things that are going to be right up against our cells. So either our alveoli in our lungs or our intestinal lining, whatever the cell might be, the capillary is right next to those tissues. So the blood can get its oxygen into our tissues much easier. And we'll talk more about that later. But those are the basics, the three basic vessels that we have. Now, the heart itself is made of cells, so the heart itself also needs to have blood coming to it to give it oxygen. And those are our coronary arteries and our cardiac veins. Those surround the heart itself. So if you've ever heard of people getting heart attacks, it's because they get a breakdown or a clot or something in the coronary arteries. So you stop being able to feed blood to your heart itself. Now, the movement of blood throughout the body is called perfusion, the constant flow of oxygenated blood to the tissues. And obviously, this has to function very well, or you die very quickly, because we need oxygen in our cells to create energy. And this is such an important function that we need this oxygen for that we can't survive very long if perfusion is bad. So we need a proper functioning heart with good cardiac output. We need an adequate volume of blood. If we have less blood than normal, we can't carry as much oxygen to our body. And we need properly sized vessels. And so in class, I'll go through some examples of what does it look like and what happens when perfusion is harmed. So how does the blood perfuse through the body? So humans have what's called double loop circulation. So we have a loop that circulates through the body and then a loop that circulates to the lungs. So the one that goes to the lungs is called the pulmonary circuit. Pulm relates to lungs. So we carry blood that does not have oxygen and push it into the lungs where we fill it up with oxygen again. And then that oxygen-rich blood comes back to the heart where the heart sends it out now into the systemic circuit. And the systemic circuit is where the blood goes to all of our tissues and all of our organs. We use up all the oxygen in it, and then we send that empty blood, the deoxygenated blood, back to the heart so it can send it back to the lungs. That's the idea here. So blood is our only fluid tissue, and it's another part of our circulatory system. And it is the vehicle that transfers the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, the nutrients, the hormones, the waste. All of it is contained inside our blood as it moves through our body. So it also is important because it moves heat to all parts of our body too. The liquid aspect of our blood, the water part of it, has that high heat capacity. So it maintains heat very well and it keeps that heat traveling to all parts of the body. It also contains all of our immune system cells that help us fight infections, and it's the cardiovascular system that pumps this all around. So there's a couple different components to our blood. There is the liquid portion of it called the plasma, and that's usually a little bit more than half, about 55% of the blood. And this is 90% water. And we also have dissolved materials in there like salt, oxygen, carbon dioxide, other dissolved proteins and hormones and signals and antibodies and all of that in there. And then we have our white blood cells and our platelets. It's this tiny, thin white layer in between the plasma and the red blood cells. We often call it the buffy coat. And this just contains all of your immune cells. And then you have the red blood cells. This usually is about 40% of your blood. And this is the red blood cells are the part that actually grab onto the oxygen, carry it to your cells, offload it, then it takes on carbon dioxide and takes that carbon dioxide back to your lungs where you exhale it out. So When you're looking at blood like this, it's kind of cool. You can tell a little bit of the health of a person. If they have very little red blood cells, they're anemic. If they have less plasma than normal, they're dehydrated. So you can get a really cool, quick snapshot of the health of a patient just from looking at the breakdown when you centrifuge their blood or spin it so that all the heavy parts fall to the bottom. So let's dive in quickly to the respiratory system, and then we'll end with the renal system. So the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system obviously go hand in hand, because if the cardiovascular system is sending blood out to the body, then back up to the lungs, then back out to the body, it's a very key player in our ability to live. So the respiratory system's function is to bring oxygen into the body and remove waste in the form of carbon dioxide. Now, we produce lots of different kinds of waste in our body and in the cell, but one of the primary ones is carbon dioxide. Now, the major structures of the respiratory system include the pharynx, the mouth and the nose, then the trachea, the diaphragm, the lungs, the alveoli, and we're going to get into those a little bit right now. So the diaphragm is the muscle that spans the bottom of your lungs here, or your ribs here, and it is underneath your lungs as well. We've taken out the lungs here for this image so you can see the entirety of the diaphragm a little bit better. Now, when this is a muscle, so when this muscle contracts, when it gets smaller, it's going to actually pull down, because we can see it's attached to the bottom of our ribs and to our spinal cord. So as it contracts, it's going to get pulled down this way. As that happens, it's going to pull on the lungs and actually make the lungs get bigger. When that happens, it actually creates a vacuum inside your lungs because you're creating more space in there, and so the pressure inside your lungs drops. As a result, that forces air in through your mouth and into your lungs. That is how you breathe. So while we consider inhalation, breathing in, to be something that we have to work to bring the air into our lungs, really all you have to do is contract your diaphragm and the air gets sucked in. Kind of a weird thing because we don't normally think of it in that term. Then when that diaphragm relaxes, it's going to push the lungs back up and actually make their volume smaller, forcing air out, and that creates exhalation or expiration or breathing out. Now, the lungs themselves are they're basically like upside down trees, and they're made of smaller and smaller and smaller branches until we get to the end that kind of looks like a cluster of grapes. So we start off with the trachea, that's the main trunk, and then it splits into the bronchus, the bronchia, and then into the bronchioles, which are these like more smaller tree limbs. And then at the end, we have the alveoli. The alveoli at the terminal end of all of your respiratory system are these little tiny air sacs. And these are completely surrounded by a capillary network because it's really important that we get blood, oxygen into and out of the blood. It's very important that we get carbon dioxide into and out of the blood. So we need the capillaries to be in very close association with where we get oxygen and where we push out carbon dioxide, which is our alveoli. So here's an example. This is a picture here of a capillary, and this right here is the thin cell layer of an alveoli. So by having the capillary and the alveoli have just a really tiny thin layer of one cell, they're able to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide between each other much faster. Now, we're going to get more into this a little bit later when we talk about diffusion and cell membranes, but I just wanted to preview it here for you. And finally, the renal system. All that we really are going to talk about with this system is that the cardiovascular system really strongly relies on the renal system for complete and optimal health. You've heard of this system before, but probably not by this name. This is the body's filtration network. It's going to include the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, the urethra. We also know it as the urinary system. Now, the primary function of the renal system is to filter waste from the blood. So yes, we have the lungs that offload the waste of CO2, but every time we deliver oxygen to our cells look at the blood and say, oh great, the trash man's here. And it dumps off a bunch of its waste into the blood, and the waste dissolves into the blood and gets taken back through the body. We don't want waste to accumulate in the blood because that can get quite toxic. So what the body will do is it will send all of that blood to the kidneys and tell the kidneys filter out all the bad stuff. So the kidneys will filter about 200 liters of blood every single day. And by managing the waste levels in the blood, it also looks at the fluid balance in the blood. And through this, it helps manage our blood pressure. It helps balance our pH. It regulates our electrolytes and a lot more. There's a whole hormone network involved with the renal system as well. We're not really going to get into that here. That's a little too much physiology for this class, but just know that without the renal system, our cardiovascular system, our blood would get overloaded with waste products very, very quickly. So we filter the blood in the kidneys and then empty all of that fluid filled with waste into the ureters. The ureters drop down into the bladder, and we fill up the bladder with this liquid that's carrying all of this waste, usually nitrogen-based waste. And when the bladder gets full, we evacuate it through the urethra as pee. And so that's it for this topic. We're going to dive into some cool stuff in class where we talk about diseases and like shock and other things like that relating to these body systems, and also how we manage our pH of our blood a little bit. So let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week.